Hello, welcome. Well, today we're going to be talking about the first Moonshot, or Agile Principles in the U.S. Ranger mission. A lot of this was inspired by a conversation I had with Dave Marsh, who I see is on here now, and a trip to the Smithsonian years ago. So what we're going to be doing is kind of looking at how, even though they may not be quantified as the Agile Principles were a very big part of the principle behind the principles. A lot of the a lot of the things that make where we're at play in the U.S. Ranger mission. So that's our plan for what we're going to be covering today. So that's today what we're talking about. Coming up, we've got Robert talking to us on the 24th about can we learn to manage uncertainty? And he says we probably can. So that's on the 24th. The invites for that should be out. If you know anybody on your team that's interested in that topic, be sure to forward the invite to them. Then on the 8th of October, Matt Rabel is going to be coming and talking to us about micro front ends for Java microservices. If any of those terms sound interesting, either from a technical standpoint or just because you're interested in being able to talk to your team or understand more what your team's talking about when they're talking about microservices and micro front ends, this will be pretty good because it's a very good demonstration. He's going to do a bunch of stuff live and let you see how things work. So I think that'll be really helpful to a lot of people. On the 22nd, Eric is going to be coming and talking to us about Deep Racer. So it's Amazon's machine learning vehicle that they use for learning how, for experimenting with machine learning, and they have competitions and things like that. I have one of these at my house. I haven't done much with it, so I'm looking forward to Eric to showing me all the things I can do with it. And then on the 5th of November, Mark McKelvey is going to be talking to us about AI and how it relates to Agile teams. So excited about hearing some of those things. Okay, so my goal is to fit this into 30 minutes. At the end, we're going to literally give away the moon because that seemed like a fitting thing. So stay tuned for that, and let's get started here. So in the 60s, a few things around here. In the 60s, the Soviets were pulling ahead in the space race with they had the first satellite, first man in the moon, first civilian in the moon, or first satellite, first animal in space, first man in space, first civilian in space, and the first woman in space. JF Kennedy was looking for something the U.S. could do in space to create a sense of national pride as well as to help himself politically. So he sent Vice President Johnson to talk to the rocket scientists to figure out a good goal for the United States. Based on the capabilities of the U.S. and the USSR, they determined that the U.S. might be able to be the first to send someone to the moon. With the current capabilities of both countries, it seemed like that was something the U.S. would be starting from a nearly even playing field with the Soviets. So that's what led to the "We Choose the Moon" speech. But getting to the moon wasn't going to be a single step. A number of programs and missions were designated to give the U.S. the experience, confidence, and momentum it needed. One of the first steps was the U.S. Ranger program that started launching soon after Kennedy made his famous speech to Congress. And the Ranger goal was to get high quality pictures for science and to select the landing site. It's easy to forget that with Earth-based telescopes, the smallest detail scientists could see on the moon were generally measured in kilometers. The actual surface of the moon was a big mystery. The Ranger missions were conceived barely 350 years after Galileo turned his telescope to the moon and realized that, contrary to Aristotle, it wasn't a beautiful, smooth sphere. It's easy to take our modern knowledge for granted, but we really had no idea what the moon was like or what was even possible. So I grew up with a large collection of children's books and the children's and science books from the 1950s. And I remember being fascinated looking at how much of a mystery space had been only a few decades prior to when I was reading these. I remember looking at the book about outer space, and one said that the surface of the moon might be so soft that any rocket landing on it would sink down into the dust. Another one said that for all we know, it could be made out of something flammable like gunpowder and just blow up once you landed on it. So let's dive into the Ranger Space Program. Let me make sure I can see the chat here. I'm actually in a campground today. Okay, it looks like the poll is saying it's locked. I think that will unlock once we get to the point that we're trying to run it. So thanks for that feedback, though. Okay, so let's look at the Ranger Space Program. It was designed with the intention of launching 9 space probes in 3 different blocks. So here's the question for you. Let's see if this works for you now. What do you think the goal of the first Ranger mission was? And Jude, let me know if that's working for you now. Throw the link in the chat too, in case anybody wants it there. What do you think the first goal was? So we got the options: orbit the Earth, make a new crater in the moon, spy on Russia, or attack Sputnik. I like the attack Sputnik, but I will tell you that is not it. So it looks like most of us have the right answer here, and it actually was the very first one was just trying to orbit the Earth. That's what they were aiming for. So these were the different blocks that they were working with. Block 1 was to test launch the spacecraft without going to the moon. Block 2 was put a single camera on it and try to hit the moon. And block 3 was multiple cameras and try to sweep over the moon and get really high resolution images. So why should they even do block 1? If the goal is to go to the moon, why waste time trying to orbit Earth? Well, remember how much was unknown. NASA knew that going to the moon was going to require creating skills, launch, and delivery capabilities that they didn't have. By setting smaller goals, they'd be able to use the feedback from small successes and failures to rapidly iterate and make improvements. So just take a guess here. How many days do you think were the average number of days between each Ranger launch? Take a guess. We got 35, got 300, 150, 75, 15. So kind of range here of different things. And we watch this SpaceX things launching and coming back down, and we've kind of got this expectation that things can happen really, really fast. That wasn't necessarily how space was approached back then. But the actual number here, here's the layout of where these are. And there's a wide variety here, but over 1,300 days, the average launch was 100 every 145 days. But notice, like between 8 and 9, that was just barely over a month. So there's some very, very rapid launches here. So now, looking at this, I want to ask, what number is closest to the average of days between your team's deployments? What do you usually do? Is it measured more in the hundreds of days or in the tens of days? I think this is an interesting thing to do because as over time, as I've asked people this question, it looks like a lot of teams are tending toward more rapid deployment, which is great. But some of us are still in this situation where it's taking 300 days to deploy, and there may be reasons that it needs to be like that. But what we're going to talk about is what the feedback actually looks like with that, and kind of what the Ranger mission found with it, and what we may discover in our software as well. Okay, so average launch was 145 days. Just want to point out that some modern software teams are deploying less frequently than these Ranger missions were launching. So this is the design for the Block 1 spacecraft. The first mission was supposed to do an elliptical Earth orbit. Unfortunately, a rocket malfunctioned and it didn't get enough altitude, so it kind of hung out at low Earth orbit for a week and then burned up in the atmosphere. Ranger 2 had the same results, but only lasted about 2 days before its fiery reentry. At this point, NASA switched to the Block 2 design for Ranger 3. So while neither of those had been successful, they did learn some things, and then they progressed to the next stage. Instead of just orbiting the Earth, Ranger 3 was aimed at the moon, but it missed and flew right by it. And it's still currently out there orbiting the sun somewhere. Ranger 4 was a success in the sense that NASA was finally able to hit the moon. At nearly 250,000 miles away, this is no small feat. Unfortunately, the solar panels didn't open up, so we didn't get any readings or pictures. Still, it was the first time the U.S. had put a man-made object on another celestial body. Hopes were very high for Ranger 5, but something went wrong with the batteries, and the probe missed the moon, headed out to join Ranger 3, still out there somewhere in orbit around the sun. NASA then pivoted to the Block 3 designs and made some big changes. They threw out many of the sensors in order to add 2 chains of redundancy and loaded up with 12 cameras. That way, if one chain failed, the other chain could transmit the pictures they were working so hard to get. Unfortunately, both chains failed and no images were returned. So at this point, the engineers had learned all kinds of things. They learned a certain type of diode didn't work well in space when you're going on that long of flights. They learned that some of the ways of making electrical connections with gold tended to flake off in ways they hadn't expected. But the scientists had learned pretty much nothing. All the systems they were counting on to return valuable information, reading, and pictures just kept failing. And they weren't nearly as excited about learning about the best type of diodes to send to space. They wanted pictures of the moon. Then finally, in 1964, the Ranger 7 mission was the first true success in the United States' early quest to explore the moon. The built spacecraft launched on the 28th, and then 3 days later, we got feedback. And this is a
The Ranger
video clip
Block
from the
3
time.
spacecraft included solar panels, an omni and high-gain antenna, mid-course motor, electronics, batteries, and the television subsystem. The TV subsystem contained 6 cameras. Launch of the Ranger missions was accomplished by an Atlas-Agena combination from Cape Kennedy. After separation from the Atlas booster, the Agena and spacecraft combination entered a parking orbit from which the spacecraft and Agena were injected on a lunar trajectory.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The mission of the Block 3 Ranger flights was to obtain television pictures of the small-scale topography in selected areas of the lunar surface, which would benefit science and the manned lunar program. On July 31, 1964, 1,120 kilometers, NASA's Ranger 7 spacecraft, 576 kilometers, impacted the moon in a pre-selected target area. Camera B provided valuable oblique views. 9 minutes to impact. Altitude, 608 kilometers. Impact. During the last 17 minutes of flight, the spacecraft transmitted back to Earth more than 4,000 pictures of the lunar surface.
So while we can't take it for granted that we were able to get that feedback from the moon, that was a very, very big deal at the time. So finally with Ranger 7, everything worked and 4,000 images were returned. These were the first close-up images of the moon ever seen and gave scientists and engineers a much better idea of what it would take to make a successful moon landing. Now, if you were an engineer, would you support changing the orbit on mission 8? So would you go, yeah, let's go ahead and try something different, or would you like, no, let's leave everything alone? Okay, so lots of us are in the, I think we may have a lot of people that are scientists on this call, more scientists in their approach than engineers maybe. But that was what was up for discussions. So scientists wanted to change the orbit for number 8 to get more pictures at a different angle, but the engineers were pushing back on it. The engineers were too worried that it might mess things up. Ranger 8 returned, so they kept it at the same orbit. Ranger 8 returned almost double the number of pictures returned and landed very close to the Sea of Tranquility, where the Apollo astronauts would land 4 years later. Now, here's a quote from the oral history at the time, one of the engineers. He said, then on the 8th, JPL wanted to do an attitude control change, so it got max resolution. We were afraid to take on any attitude changes that might introduce a glitch. We were on a mission, so we wouldn't let them do it. But on 9, we did, and they got the maximum resolution on 9, and you could get objects about this size, and I think he held up his hands to be about a foot. Now, notice how the engineers and scientists worked together to balance the risk and rewards. From Earth, they were able to see things that were measured in kilometers, but this last mission gave them pictures with the resolution measured in fractions of a meter. The scientists and engineers worked out a different angle for the final Ranger mission, so mission number 9. It was a huge success. In addition to the most detailed pictures of the moon ever seen, the equipment returned gravitational information that showed the moon's center of mass were different than its geometric center. So there was a huge number of factors at play in this program, even well beyond the different needs of engineers and scientists. At one point, the management structure was completely changed in order to emphasize better engineering practices to increase the chances of success. Sounds like something that could happen on some software projects, right? There were definitely big political forces at a local, national, and even international scale that were coming to play here. But despite all this, everyone was able to work together and successfully create a repeatable process for getting the probes to the moon. So from NASA fact sheet, it said, thus after long trouble-plagued start that taught the system engineers a great deal and the scientists virtually nothing, Project Ranger finished with 3 flights that greatly enhanced the lunar scientists' knowledge of the surface and whetted their appetites for a closer look. So one important thing I think that there's some really good takeaways for Agile software development to think about here is they weren't just building a space probe, they were building a system to deliver a space probe to the moon. So the question for you is, how does your team see your job? Do they see it as creating software, or do they see it as creating a system for delivering functionality? And I want to suggest that wherever you fall on this now, leaning toward the idea that we're thinking of creating a system for delivering functionality will push you a lot closer to the type, will create behavior that's the type of thing that made the Ranger project successful. That idea of we're building a system to deliver things rather than just this is a one and done. Because if we're kind of a one and done, then we tend to batch things together and take on a lot more risk instead of kind of taking the approach where Ranger was doing of expecting things to fail, but we're going to create this system where we can repeatedly do stuff. You aren't just building software, you're building a system to deliver software. So Agile says that our highest priority is satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. No matter how much planning was done, the real progress came when the Ranger team started launching rockets and learning what worked and what didn't. Up until then, it was all theoretical. Planning for your code is important, but progress is what happens when you get people to actually use your code. As the Agile principles say, working software is the primary measure of progress. I was once working with a team who said they couldn't tell management that they weren't on track to finish by the due date because of the political implications. So now imagine if the Ranger missions didn't want to communicate that the diodes had failed or that they had missed the moon. They would have had a very hard time improving things in that type of environment. Now, the space mission was very, very public, but sometimes things can be hidden in software projects in ways that keep the team from learning what they actually need to learn in order to make progress. Failures are necessary in order to move forward. The whole Ranger mission was predicated on the idea that some of what they were going to try wasn't going to work, and then using that feedback to rapidly try again with improvements. With the Rangers missions, this meant finding ways to improve everything from the way soldering connections to the circuit boards worked to the management structure over the program. So, how does your program compare to the Ranger missions? Are you using failure to drive your project forward? And I think that's one of the big things I hope we take away from this talk is just thinking about how the Ranger missions handled their failure to move forward and ask ourselves, is that how we're using failure on our projects? Your team's progress depends on being able to figure out why things broke so you have a chance of keeping them from breaking again next time. While this may seem like common sense, it's specifically called out with the Agile principles with at regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective, then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. You'll probably recognize this principle as the reason teams have retrospectives, but notice the wording. The focus is on making actual improvements. It isn't enough to get together and complain about things we'd like to see changed. Imagine if the Ranger team had retrospectives where they complained about how the space environment was causing gold flaking, or how they wished the diodes that worked on Earth would work the same way in space. But have you ever been in a retrospective for a software team where all the time is spent complaining about problems they can't change? I remember one team where that was actually happening. The complaints were legitimate, but no progress was being made in tuning and adjusting behavior. But when we started saying, yes, but what can we do about this problem? Then things started turning around. We couldn't make the other team collaborate with us. That wasn't within our control, but asking them to eat lunch with us was within our control. While it was a small step, just getting to know each other better started building the groundwork for better collaboration. So, how would you describe your team's retrospective focus? Are your teams focused on, well, first of all, the question, what teams do retrospectives? Are your teams focused on things the team has no control over, things outside the control of the team, things that are inside the control of the team, or questions like whether cereal is soup or none of the above? So we got about 14% just asking, wow, teams are doing retrospectives. Looks like the majority of us are focused on things that the team has control over, which is great. And I imagine there's a variety here. Within one retrospective, there may be some focused on things outside the control. I personally like questions like whether cereal is soup. But this is a useful thing to ask ourselves. Are we looking at things that we can actually are actionable, that we can change what we're doing? Or are we so focused on how we're being impacted from the outside that we stop looking at how we can actually improve stuff ourselves? So an important thing to take away from the Ranger mission is that launching frequently was one of the keys to making improvements. So like I said, here's the list. Some of these things are barely 2 months apart. Some of them not even 2 months apart. So they had to be very strategic in what they were going to do different between missions. A good example of this was the back and forth in Mission 8 when the engineers were pushing to keep everything the same to see if they could repeat the success of Mission 7. The Ranger missions would have looked very different if they were only launching every 2 years. On a software project, there's a huge difference between a team that delivers code every 6 months, one that delivers code every 7 days, and one that delivers code multiple times a day. The Ranger team may not have had the Agile principles yet, but they were definitely following the idea behind deliver working software frequently from a couple of weeks to a couple of months with a preference to the shorter time scale. Frequency matters, and your team's ability to get software into your users' hands with low cycle time is a big part of what determines your success. Not only does it help keep everyone focused on what's important, but it also lowers the risk of a small misstep because you can make corrections before things get too off course. My company was creating an application for a subsidiary of it was a medium-sized local company, and we had been doing stuff for a few years and delivering stuff pretty regularly to them every week or even multiple times a week. The CEO called me and said, "Hey, I want you to look at our other internal software project." It was this big system that they're building, looked very exciting. I was impressed with the scope of it, but I asked how much of this is actually in production, and he said none of it. We've been working on this for 5 years, and not a single line of code is producing any return on investment for us. He went on to explain that their CEO and their owners hated the software projects because they spent so much money without knowing if it was actually going to be useful or not. And the problem wasn't that their team was having trouble writing code. The problem was that they weren't focused on frequently getting that code into people's hands so it could be used to do real work. The Ranger engineers had to satisfy scientists and Congress. So what does Agile say about satisfying customers? Well, there's a principle for that, right? Our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. Now, it's interesting to see how the whole Ranger program was designed to have early and frequent success. With 9 planned launches, they were setting themselves up for showing progress frequently. And even the missions with major failures were providing some small but valuable success, like getting a probe into space or successfully hitting the moon. A relative of mine had built an online wedding fair site, started out just using a blogging platform for it, and finally got to the point where she needed a customized system to handle all the content and the advertisers. So she hired some developers who took a large chunk of her money and went heads down for it on a year or so. Instead of early and continuous delivery features, they just gave her a bunch of code at the end that did something that was, in the words of Douglas Adams, almost but not entirely unlike what was needed to run the site. It was a disaster, and eventually she had to shut down her fledgling business. So how does your team, so that with that negative example, think about how your team satisfies your customers. Are you showing early and continuous delivery of things that make their lives better? Or are you trying to batch things together to deliver large chunks of what you think they want? The longer you go without discovering how well your work is satisfying the customer, the more catastrophic changes can be. The Ranger program was designed to expect change, and this was good because there were a lot of things they ended up needing to change. Around the end of block 2, the diodes that worked fine on other missions were causing problems with gold flaking. They ended up changing the camera setup to deal with failures and even changing the orbit. The Ranger team seemed they were very prepared to follow the Agile principle that says we're going to welcome changing requirements even late in development. Agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. Your team's going to have a lot easier time following this principle when they're following the other principles about frequent delivery. Embracing a changing requirement when you're getting feedback after days worth of work is much easier than finding out the thing you've been building for the last year isn't what the customer needs. Uh, we were working with a management customer or a building management system for a genetics company, and they wanted all the lab work done directly on the computer from the lab technicians. So we built a piece of that, but it didn't take too long to discover that the computer introduced all kinds of inefficiencies and potential for errors. There's paper is a really good way to write down notes, but when you're trying to juggle, vials and pipettes and microscope slides, the computer kind of got in the way. So we welcomed the changing requirements and changed the workflow to make it easy for one person to just take all the handwritten forms and type it into the system later. The resulting simpler workflow only happened because everyone was willing to actually embrace the idea of having changing requirements. It's easy to overlook how much simplicity is driven by willing to accept changing requirements. If you aren't willing to ever modify something, even when it's clear it's no longer needed, you'll end up with lots of complexity encrusted everywhere in your application that just makes it harder to make any changes, harder to understand, and more error prone. The Ranger mission, it's an example from the Ranger mission, they originally tried sterilizing probes with heat, but they found it was way too complicated. So they found a simpler solution just by putting the probe in a gas chamber and sterilizing it that way. So this simplification probably would have been overlooked if they weren't trying to deliver so frequently, or if they weren't open to embracing change. It's an excellent example of how the principles work together to improve the process. And of course, Agile has something to say about simplicity too. Simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done, is essential. Now, Ranger may not have had this principle from the Agile Manifesto yet, but they certainly knew it was important for them, just like it's important for your software project. Several years ago, I was working with executive at a bank, or speaking with executive at a bank about a large software project they were doing. It required a huge amount of manual testing, but the testing was done like way after the point that the software was actually developed. And they were finding defects faster than the software, than they were actually finishing user stories. So every week they were moving backwards because there was more work to do, because there were more things to fix than what they had before. I suggested that their complex manual testing wouldn't be nearly as necessary if they built automated testing into the development process. So instead of the complexity of trying to manually test after the code had been written, they could write the test first so they could be used through the whole process of writing code. Now, the idea of just don't do it when it came to their current testing approach might have sounded crazy, but it would have been an agile simplification that would have maximized the amount of work not done. Okay, so that's our fly through of looking at the space program, the Ranger space program, and how it relates to Agile. I hope that's useful. So now we're going to do something. We're going to give, like I said, we're going to give away the moon. This is a moon nightlight that we are going to send to one lucky winner. If you're in the United States, if you're outside the United States, we'll have to coordinate it because I don't know if I can ship it out, but we'll get something for that. So if you can stick around, we'll go through this, a few questions about the Ranger space program and the relation to Agile here. Let me throw this link here for you one more time in case anybody needs it. All right. Give a few seconds for anybody to join. Is that working for everybody? Everybody able to get to that? Figure, let's see a few more people. Okay. Keep in mind, you're competing to win the moon here. Okay, first Moonshot quiz question. What was the primary goal of the Ranger program? The primary goal of the Ranger program, was it to spy on Sputnik, take pictures of the moon, photograph the Earth, retrieve soil samples from the moon, take a chimp to the moon, or crash into the moon? What was the primary goal of the Ranger program? Got about 7 seconds remaining to get your answers locked in. And the primary goal was, yes, to get pictures of the moon. Keep in mind, we didn't even know what it was made out of. So they were trying to find a way to land on the moon. They needed to get pictures to see what it was made out of, see how we could land, or if it was even possible to land there. Okay, there's our leaderboard. Moving on. When did the engineers really start learning rapidly? Was it when the first Ranger hit the moon? Was it when they started doing research for the program? Was it when they started unsuccessfully launching spacecrafts? When Congress appropriated the money? Or when managers got called into Congress to testify about the failures? Which is interesting. You can go back and watch the videos of them getting grilled on the hot seat about the things that weren't working well. So yes, it's when they started unsuccessfully launching spacecrafts. There's all kinds of things that they didn't know until they actually tried doing it. Just like there's all kinds of things you don't know about your software until you get it into the customer's hands. Okay, leaderboard there. Who wanted to change the moon orbit for the 8th mission? Was it the engineers? Was it Congress? Was it General Grant? Or was it the scientists? Who wanted to change the moon orbit for the 8th mission? Engineers, Congress, General Grant, or scientists? 5 seconds remaining. And yes, it was the scientist. And one thing I think that's interesting to think about this is the fact that they were launching so rapidly probably made it a lot easier for the engineers and scientists to come to the conclusion that they wanted to keep things the same. If the scientists knew they weren't going to get another launch for 3 years, they probably would have pushed back really, really hard to get things changed. But since it was going to happen, I think in this case, it was like 32 days later, it was probably a lot easier to say, okay, we'll go and do this one the same, and then we'll make the change in the next one. So another win for frequent delivery. Okay, leaderboard, we've got guest in the top spot, followed by Boz, another guest, Greg, Dave, Greg, guest, Lynn, Jude, and another guest. Moving on, how did scientists and engineers work together on the 8th mission? Engineers and scientists agreed changing the orbit was low risk. Scientists convinced engineers that the value of changing the orbit was worth the risk. Engineers convinced scientists that the risk of changing the orbit was greater than the value. Or engineers said, we'll change the orbit, but don't come crying to us when it crashes. Now, I will tell you, I have seen a lot of software engineers basically use that last line with things before. It's an easy, but I think it's telling that is not what happened in this situation. Yes, the engineers convinced the scientists that the risk of changing the orbit was greater than the value they'd get from it. And there'd be more value of trying to do the exact same thing and get more pictures. And they did. They ended up getting double the number of pictures they had previously. Okay, there's leaderboard again. We got guest Greg, guest Greg. Oh, we got multiple Gregs. Lynn, guest. Age. I need to find out how to pronounce your name. A or age. Jared, Boz, and another guest. So I think this may be the last question or second last. What Agile principle was demonstrated in the 8th and 9th mission? Was it sustainable pace? And we just obliquely mentioned this. So sustainable pace, face-to-face communication, build projects around motivated individuals, doctrine of mutual destruction. I'll give you a hint, that is not an Agile principle. Or deliver working software frequently. What principle was demonstrated in the 8th and 9th mission? This may require a little bit of a jump, but I think some of you will get it. So yes, deliver working software frequently. Remember, that was from the 8th and 9th mission was just over a month. It was really, really rapid that when they turned that around. So it was demonstrating that principle of they're able to make better decisions by doing things rapidly. And there's our final score. So guess 552, whoever you are, if you want to take a screenshot and email me, and so I can see that you're guess 552, give me your address, and I will get a moon headed your way if you're in the United States. If you're outside the United States, let me know, and I'll see if I can get you one. I don't know how that will work out with sending batteries and stuff. But anyway, thank you all for coming. I hope that was useful. Oh, the other thing I want to give you here is please fill out the survey if you've got just a few seconds. This was a different format. I tried a few things different, a little more history involved in it. I also did more, tried to keep things moving a little more and fit it into 30 minutes. I'd love to get some feedback on that. See what you think worked well and what didn't. I gave this talk a few years ago, and before doing this one, I went back through and read all the surveys, and there were a couple things where people said this slide didn't make sense, so I tried to make that better. So if there's anything that didn't resonate or you didn't think was useful, or that you thought was particularly useful, please go ahead and let me know. I'd love to hear about that. But please, if you can take the time to fill this out, it's very, very useful to me, and I really appreciate it. So with that, I'll turn it over. If anybody's got anything they would like to chat about, I would love to talk. If not, the other thing I failed to mention was the space thing was particularly interesting to me because this is, it's not that long ago this was happening, but this session right here that I'm giving to you right now is actually being streamed over satellite on Starlink. We're at a campground. And so it was kind of an interesting thing to think how far we've come in a fairly short amount of time from let's just see if we can hit the moon to now I'm talking to you all over a bunch of satellites that are whizzing around the Earth. Okay, any thoughts, comments, suggestions, aggregations? Thanks, Lucas.